Hey guys, tonight we open another set of mysteries. 8 stories that stretch across snowbound mountains, silent villages, strange lights in the sky, and ghost ships at sea. Some speak of hikers and pilots who vanished mid-journey. Others of towns left empty, with no trace of where their people went. There are tales of glowing craft witnessed by crowds, airships drifting across the 19th century sky, and waters where ships and planes slip away without farewell. These are the puzzles history never closed, stories that linger not to frighten, but to wonder. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what was the last thing you remember before sleep pulled you under. Now dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with the Yuba County Five, a story from 1978 that has often been compared to the Dyatlov Pass tragedy of the Ural Mountains. But this mystery unfolded far from Siberia's snow, in California's Sierra Nevada, where 5 young men disappeared into a chain of events that investigators still cannot fully explain. 5 friends set out on a Friday evening near the end of February the 24th. They lived in and around Yuba City and Marysville, worked small jobs, lived with family, and looked after one another in the way small groups do. Each had his own habits and limits. One had served in the army and kept a tidy car. One was a gentle joker who loved sports schedules. One kept to routine and phoned his grandmother twice a week. One carried a diagnosis that needed medication, which at the time seemed under control. Their parents spoke later about how excited they were for the next morning. A basketball tournament for a community league, uniforms set out, snacks prepared, the small but real pride of showing up as a team. They drove north to California State University at Chico to watch a game, then headed home a little before midnight. They stopped at a convenience store for a quick armful of treats, chocolate bars, fruit pies, a few sodas. Their route home should have been simple, south and then southeast toward the flatlands. But sometime after the city lights thinned, the car took a side road that curled up into the Plumas foothills, and then farther into the forest. By the time anyone knew they were missing, the weekend had passed. Families called around, then called authorities. A search looked first along the direct route, straight roads across farmland, small towns in between, but nothing appeared. The first proof that something had gone off pattern came a few days later on a cold mountain road. A white Mercury sedan, the one the friends used that night, sitting where the pavement had given way to gravel and then to packed snow. The car told a quiet story. It was unlocked, one window partly down, and there was no sign of a crash. The undercarriage showed no deep scrapes, which meant whoever drove it had nursed it over ruts without harming it. The tires were not buried. The tank still had gas. With 5 grown men, it could likely have been pushed back along the ruts and turned, but it had been left. Inside, wrappers from the late-night snack stop sat where they had been dropped. The keys were not in the ignition. At that elevation, on that night, the air temperature would have stood well below freezing, around -7 degrees Celsius, or about 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The higher hollows would have been colder. Searchers widened their circle up and down the road, into spurs out along logging tracks, then halted as new snow erased tracks. A deputy tried the sedan's engine. It started without complaint. That detail stayed in the center of people's minds. Why leave a working car on a cold night in a remote place? One man who knew that stretch of road said he had been there on the same night. He had driven up to check conditions on a weekend cabin and bogged down in snow. He felt chest pains and lay back in his own car to recover, drifting in and out. He told investigators he saw lights outside, flashlights moving, a flicker that might have been headlights, and heard voices. He said a group passed close to his car, then moved away. He called out for help, and the lights faded back into the trees. Later, he saw a similar car parked where his had been earlier. White, the same shape. His experience matters, and yet the timing, the cold, and his pain could have altered details. It is a piece of the night, not the whole of it. Winter loosened its grip in the first week of June. A small group out for an early season ride noticed that a window on a Forest Service trailer lay open and broken. The trailer sat in a seasonal road camp more than a dozen miles from where the car had been found, deeper into Plumas National Forest, the kind of place crews use in the summer when they cut brush and keep the roads open. Inside, the riders found quiet, and then the stillness of the missing. Under a stack of bedding on a narrow cot, they found one of the men, Theodore, known as Ted. He had wrapped himself in layers, bed sheets, then blankets, pulled tight around his shoulders and chin. A beard had grown on his face. His feet were badly damaged, likely from frost and infection. A pathologist would later estimate that he had lived for weeks in that trailer. He had lost a great deal of weight. The cause of death was listed as starvation and exposure. The room around him sharpened the questions. In the small kitchen area, someone had pried open storage with a pocket knife. A few cans were opened and eaten. Boxes of dehydrated meals stood stacked, but largely untouched. Along an outside wall, a large propane tank sat full, connected to a heater that, if lit, would have warmed the space. The pilot light had never been turned on. There were matches and a few paperback books. The door's lock was intact. The broken window had likely been used to enter. On a table lay simple items you would expect in such a place. A handyman's can opener, a first aid kit, a detailed manual for the heater, and a note about winterizing. There was fuel and food enough here for men to wait for spring, if they knew how to use it, or if they felt free to do so. A search around the camp found more traces. Footprints led out into deadfall and brush. A small patch of burned-out materials lay near the trailer, as if someone had tried to make a fire under pine boughs. Farther back down the way the road ran, searchers found the remains of two men a little over halfway to the car, one on either side of the track, as if they had fallen in different directions in the snow and stopped moving not far from each other. They were Jack and William. Their pockets held small items, coins, a keyring. Nearby lay a flashlight that had burned out long before. As crews kept combing the country, A few days later, they found parts of another body in thick brush near a creek. The clothing matched what their families had described. That was Jack, the younger one. No trace of Gary was ever located, though his shoes were found inside the trailer. Those shoes were a small clue. They were light tennis shoes. Ted's sturdier shoes were missing. If Gary had given up his shoes for Ted at some point, or swapped them before leaving the trailer, it would suggest he had been inside and then had gone back out. He did not return. All of that built a line on the map. From the car to the trailer, the crow would have counted almost 20 miles. On the ground, following service roads that loop and climb, it was farther still. The two men found in between had likely started toward the trailer and stopped for the last time before reaching it. Someone had reached the trailer. Someone had stayed long enough to open a few cans, to wrap a friend carefully, to try a fire. And yet, the simplest resources sat untouched. Families and investigators tried to fit reasons to this path. The first and most modest idea is a wrong turn, followed by a choice made worse by weather and darkness. Leaving Chico instead of arcing south toward home, the car could have taken an easy right and ended on a road that seemed to aim the same direction until, without much warning, it turned into forest. The driver was careful with his car, which matches the lack of damage underneath. He was also known not to enjoy unfamiliar mountain roads at night, which makes the detour feel strange, unless something convinced them to keep going. Snow lying on shaded sections can fool even locals into misjudging distance and traction. A bend in that road can urge you forward before you admit you should turn around. The second idea calls on a human note, an attempt to help. The man with chest pains told of a group passing his vehicle during the night, lights moving, voices in the cold. He thought he had called for help to no answer, but later he believed one of them approached briefly. If the 5 friends encountered a stopped car and someone in distress, they may have left their own car to try to help or to go for assistance. In deep cold at night, a short walk becomes a long one, and a long one becomes punishing. This idea rises and falls on how much weight you give to a witness alone in the dark with a hurting heart. It is possible. It is not certain. A third idea draws on social dynamics. Some in the group could be cautious, others more confident. One of the men relied on daily medication. If he did not have it with him, the long hours after the game could have been hard for him. If he urged that they keep moving toward a place he thought he recognized, or toward lights he believed he saw, and the others went along, they might have climbed deeper into the forest without a plan for how to come back down. People do follow a friend rather than leave him alone in a hard moment. Families later said they believed the group would not abandon one another easily. The evidence fits that. 2 bodies together near the road, careful wrapping of a friend in a trailer, shoes swapped to help someone with injured feet. The puzzling part remains the trailer, with its food and its unlit heater. Supporters of the wrong turn theory note that these men were careful with the property, taught not to break or take what was not theirs. The broken window may have felt like a major step at first. After that, perhaps they stopped short of breaking into locked pantries or turning valves they did not understand. Instructions can be dense. A propane system left for a summer crew often needs a sequence of steps. If you worry about doing harm, you leave things alone. Others add that the men might have been hungry, frightened, and cold, operating on little sleep and less judgment. Even people without any diagnosed difficulty can miss obvious choices when the stakes feel wrong and the hour is late. There are larger, hazier possibilities that some raise. The presence of another person on the road that night who frightened them, or a conflict that started on the mountain and grew. But there is nothing on the ground to anchor those ideas. No signs of a struggle at the car. No damage. No other vehicle linked clearly to the timeline. The witness with chest pains mentioned a set of lights and voices. He also said that, in his first half sleep, he thought he saw a shape that included a woman holding a baby, which later readers agree is probably not part of what happened. Pain and fear play with memory. His account gives us the sense of movement on that road, not a full cast of characters. If you set the facts in a row and allow for ordinary human choices, some good, some poor, one chain emerges. Leaving the city late, they made a wrong turn, and momentum carried them uphill. Snow stopped the car at the edge of traction. They did not want to chew up the undercarriage, so they did not gun the engine or rock the car hard. They stepped out to see the road, found it quiet and dim, and colder than they expected. They followed a track, perhaps trying to find help, perhaps chasing a distant light. Two turned back, or slowed, and could not keep moving in the cold. The others pushed on. They found the summer trailer, broke a window when they could not open the door. Inside, they tended to the friend in the worst shape, wrapped him in layers, opened a few cans, and tried to warm the space with what seemed safe. At some point, at least one of them went back out, maybe to look for the others, maybe to find wood, maybe because he thought he had found a better way. He did not make it back. Time passed, and inside the trailer, the wrapped man lay quiet and waited far longer than anyone expected. And then he, too, was still. People reach for comparisons when they find a story shaped like this. They bring in the name of a winter pass in the Ural Mountains, or in other ranges far to the south, as if to borrow a gravity that is already present. The geography here does not need it. It is a simple winter ridge, a locked gate on a seasonal camp, a narrow road that climbs farther than you think when you start up it, and then falls silent when the snow comes. The mystery is plain and stubborn, because no one who was there could come home and say what pushed the first choice or the second. The airship wave of 1897. For weeks, towns across the American Midwest reported the same strange thing. A craft gliding low across rooftops and farm fields, steady lights moving silently through the night. Newspapers from the Great Plains to the Gulf filled their pages with breathless accounts, leaving behind not clarity, but questions. The setting is late spring in the United States, in the last years of the 19th century. Flight is still a hope, not a routine. Balloons go up at fairs. Inventors sketch wings in notebooks. A few bold experiments have lifted people off the ground for short, uncertain hops. But controlled flight across cities is still ahead. Telegraph wires stitch towns together. Papers are cheap. Editors print what their readers send. The evenings are mild. On many nights in April, the air sits at about 15 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit after sundown, and people stand on porches to cool off. They look up more than we do today because the sky is clean of contrails and airport lights. So when a light shows where it should not be, they see it. There is a preface to the wave. In November of the year before, reports from Northern California described a moving light with a search beam gliding over Sacramento and nearby towns. It was said to drift low, pause, and proceed as if under deliberate control. The newspapers there printed drawings of a cigar-shaped craft with wings and a rudder, and letters poured in from readers who said they had also seen it. By winter, those stories had thinned. Then, as March turned to April in 1897, the reports began anew, farther east, and then they multiplied. A little after supper in early April, people in small Kansas towns step outside and point. A luminous spot, like a lantern at a great height, moves slowly against a steady south wind. In some places, woolly clouds frame it. In others, the night is clear and the stars are sharp. Farmers say the thing does not wobble like a balloon. One describes a dark body behind the light, long and curved, like a sleeping whale. Another says it has wings that rise and fall, though it is difficult to tell if that motion is real or a trick of light. Within days, the same kind of account surfaces across Missouri and Iowa. A town marshal in one county writes that the object came in from the west a little after 9 at night, passed over the courthouse dome, and climbed away toward the river. He adds that it made a faint whirring sound, like a windmill in a light breeze, and that a beam swept ahead of it, searching the ground in a slow, steady arc. The next evening, citizens in a city farther east gather on a hotel roof to watch the same thing drift over the rail yard. They time it by the clock in the lobby. It takes 4 minutes to cross the width of the town, then climbs faster than a man can run and vanishes. Texas begins to carry the story in mid-April. Papers in Dallas, Fort Worth, and smaller communities between print accounts that keep the same shape but change in detail. A judge and a former mayor stand on a veranda and watch a light approach from the north a little before 10. They describe a torpedo-shaped craft with a bright lamp at its front, behaving as if someone were steering it. A group on another street says it passed low enough that they heard voices. One man claims that a grappling hook, an anchor with flukes, dragged briefly on a rooftop and scratched shingles loose before it rose again. A farmer in a nearby county reports that the thing dropped into a pasture just after midnight, that he and his sons ran toward it with lanterns, and that a person leaning over its side asked, in a very clear voice, for a bucket of water to cool a motor. By the time they had crossed the fence, he says, the craft had lifted and gone. Some nights bring more than a sighting. In a town outside of Waco, a crowd follows a moving beam down Main Street and out past the last houses. They find a patch of grass laid flat in a figure roughly the size of a wagon circle, as if something had pressed down and quickly departed. A boy puts his palm to the stems and declares them warm. In another state, a railroad crew riding a handcar back to their depot sees a light drop low along the tracks, keeping pace as they pump. One reaches for the brake, slips, and by the time he looks up, the thing has climbed, its beam diminishing until it is only a white speck among stars. Newspapers fill their columns with these scenes. Some include names and occupations. A few letters to the editor come from mayors, sheriffs, and doctors, people meant to settle a reader's nerves with professional credibility. Other pieces are little more than a paragraph and a sketch. The drawings repeat a set of features: a long, tapered body, a tail like a rudder, wings or sometimes fins on the sides, and a large light at the nose. More curious are the accounts that bring the airship to ground. In several of those, the operators talk. They claim to be a small crew working for an inventor who will soon reveal his machine. They ask for water or coal oil, then drift off into the night before anyone can tie them down with questions. The most famous episode attaches itself to a tiny town with a windmill at the edge of a garden. On a Sunday morning, according to a single report printed at the time, the airship struck the windmill and came down. The article described wreckage scattered through an orchard and a small, badly injured pilot. It mentioned a burial in the local cemetery, and it claimed that metal unusual for the day was recovered. The item was short. The editor did not follow it with a detailed inquiry. For many years, the town carried the story softly. Then later generations tried to find supporting records and were met with gaps: a damaged grave marker with no confirmed origin, a well on private land that once held scraps of metal, and more questions than answers. On a different page, a man from a small Kansas community writes an affidavit that reads like a frontier tall tale. He says an airship lowered a rope over his cow pasture and carried off a heifer. He adds that he and his neighbors chased the craft for a mile before it freed the animal, which fell and left a mark they could measure. His statement is witnessed and stamped. Decades later, a ledger turns up that lists him among a local club devoted to creative fibbing, and the story slides into a new category, part of the folklore built around the wave rather than a trusted piece of it. Read enough of the period's coverage and patterns emerge. The airship appears most often on clear nights with calm or lightly variable winds. Many sightings cluster between 8 and 11 in the evening. The thing rarely, if ever, is seen in daylight. And when it is seen several towns apart on the same night, the times line up in one direction, as if a single object moved along a line, covering long distances in short order. Witnesses often compare its speed to that of an express train. A few claim it shot upward and away so quickly that it left them dizzy. What could have made those lights in those skies? The simplest explanation starts with what the sky was doing then. In April of that year, Venus shone in the western sky after sunset, bright enough to catch the eye. The planet holds steady in position, but not in appearance. Near the horizon, with thin haze or wood smoke in the air, the eye can interpret its twinkling as movement. Some observers described a color shift, a warm, pearly light on one side, a violet tinge on the other, phrases that also appear in records of bright planets seen low. Arcturus, a star rising in the east in spring, can appear unusually vivid as well. A man who has read his almanac but looks up through tired eyes may feel certain that the light is advancing over his gate when, in fact, it is holding its celestial place as the night turns. This theory solves some cases, especially those where a single bright point was reported, and the observers could not make out a dark body behind it. Its weakness lies in the many accounts that include controlled changes in direction, steady progress against a known wind, and interactions close to the ground. Another explanation leans on fireworks and balloons. Paper balloons lifted by hot air, sometimes with a lantern beneath, were not unusual in that era. A careful prankster could launch one from a hill and send a moving light across a town. Some papers printed confessions of just that, a cluster of boys releasing a paper globe that drew an entire neighborhood to the street. But such balloons are at the mercy of the breeze. They drift with it. They do not turn against it or climb in quick, deliberate bursts. If the reports had come only on 1 or 2 nights and only from a few places, balloons would cover them handily. They do not account for week after week of appearances reported along a path that crossed half a continent. A third idea holds that someone, somewhere, had built a working powered airship, lighter than air, with a small motor and a rudder, and was testing it in stages, keeping the project quiet until the design could be secured by patents or a dramatic demonstration. There were engines then, small enough to lift with a gas bag and strong enough to turn a propeller. In Europe, a few experimental ships had moved under control for short distances. In the United States, tinkers and mechanics followed those reports closely. The letters printed after some encounters, where a pilot asks for water and talks of a cross-country journey, feel as though they belong to this view. The trouble is what comes next. If such a machine existed and traveled from the Great Plains to the Gulf, some public record would likely follow. An inventor's name, a demonstration for investors, a patent filed, a photograph that holds up under scrutiny. None of that surfaced in the years after, despite many people searching. Press culture itself adds another layer. Editors in that period competed fiercely. A good story moved copies. Telegraph lines meant that an eye-catching account printed in one city could be picked up and embellished in another by the next afternoon. Some newspapers later admitted to inventing details, and a few to inventing entire stories, to keep pace with the appetite of their readers. The cow abduction tale, with its later tie to a jokester's club, is a caution many historians keep close. And yet, buried among clear inventions are steady, sober accounts. The town marshal's note about the wind, the watchman's careful timing as the object crossed one block to the next, the courthouse roof crowded with quiet citizens, naming and recognizing one another. One detail from the time stands out as both charming and telling. As the story spread, some papers speculated that a famous American inventor had built the airship in secret. He read the rumors and publicly denied them, saying he had done no such work. His denial was printed in several cities within days. The hope that a celebrated name could tidy the mystery lasted until the man himself set it aside, and then readers were back where they began, with lights and witness voices. Close to the end of the wave, as April gave way to the first warm days of May, the reports tapered. Rain moved in. The nights were less clear. Other stories filled the columns. A few items still appeared. An airship crossing a river at dawn, a beacon floating above a stockyard. But the feeling that the country was under a moving marvel faded. People took their chairs off the sidewalks and went back indoors. The sky kept its habits. Looking back, the airship wave of 1897 rests on a wide stack of newspaper clippings and a smaller set of corroborated details. There are no authenticated photographs of the craft. There is no verified piece of machinery. There are, instead, patterns, clusters of sightings, repeated features, and the way certain towns reported on certain nights. In the years that followed, researchers kept pulling at threads. Some found the origins of obvious hoaxes. Others tracked weather reports and compared wind directions to the direction of travel in the accounts. A few asked astronomers about the positions of the evening planet and the bright spring stars, and found that some evenings lined up well with celestial impostors. And yet there remain those calm, consistent reports that resist easy folding into any one theory. A moving light with a shape behind it, a beam playing over a field, a divergence from the wind, a low pass above a church spire, a climb, and a vanishing. If you stand in a small town now on a temperate evening, about 15 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and look up when the stars first come on, you can imagine the hush that must have settled on those sidewalks in 1897. Everyone's attention pulled toward a single, quiet line of motion. The next story takes us to Australia, to a schoolyard in 1966, where hundreds of students and teachers looked up on an ordinary autumn morning and saw something extraordinary. This is the Westall encounter, a sighting so many witnessed, and yet one that remains unexplained. The place is Clayton South, on the southeast fringe of Melbourne. In early April 1966, Westall High School sits beside Westall State School, their ovals and asphalt courts spilling toward a stretch of wild ground locals simply call the Grange. It is a mosaic of sand, scrub, and scattered trees, with a line of pines at the far side and market gardens beyond. Moorabbin Airport, a busy hub for training aircraft, lies a short drive to the south. The day is clear, the breeze light. Temperatures hover around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of gentle warmth that sends classes outside at recess. A little before 11 in the morning, the first calls go up, kids pointing, teachers squinting against the sun. A silvery object is moving low over the school and angling toward the open land of the Grange. Some say it is shaped like a saucer with a slight dome. Others say more like an upturned bowl or a flattened disc. One science teacher, a calm and careful man, later describes it as matte gray, about the size of a family car, gliding without a sound he could hear over the chatter of children. Several students remember a faint purple tinge at the edges as sunlight struck its surface. It moves faster than a balloon in the wind, slower than a plane. and it flies a line that does not quite match any of the usual training circuits. A cluster of small aircraft begins to circle the area, light planes from the nearby airport by most accounts, and they seem to take an interest in the object. Witnesses describe 3, 4, perhaps 5, banking around as if curious or cautious. The object glides past the school and drops behind the stand of pines at the far edge of the grange. Then everything on the schoolyard edges forward. Students run for the fence. Teachers follow, some trying to keep order, some just as curious as the children they shepherd. The sprint across the scrub is its own memory. Shoes filling with sand, legs scratched by low tea tree, the heavy smell of dry grass, and then a gap in the trees that opens to a paddock with trampled grass. At the center, close to the base of the pines, they see it again, hovering low, a few meters above the ground by most accounts, wobbling slightly as if balancing on a cushion of air. Several witnesses say the object dips, almost touches down, then lifts again with a smooth, quick motion that makes one young girl stumble as she tries to get closer. The light planes circle. A few brave students and a teacher kick into a sprint, hoping to reach it. Before they can, the object tilts, climbs, and shoots away to the southwest. The word many people use is fast, followed by a silent hand gesture that cuts diagonally up and out. It is gone in a moment. The paddock holds what the sky leaves behind. A rough circle of flattened grass, maybe a little larger than a backyard pool, bends in a single direction as if pressed by something heavy or hot. The edges are neat enough that a few students walk around it as if it were a prize in a museum. One boy says the stems are warm to the touch. Another says they are not. A teacher kneels and runs her palm across the blades, looking for scorch marks, finding only a uniform press. Across the next hours, onlookers come and go. Police arrive, then men in neat suits who do not give their names. Some carry notebooks. One steps off the circle's diameter in long strides and writes down the number. Back at the school, the rest of the day lands with a dull thud. There is an assembly, according to multiple former students, where the headmaster tells everyone to stop talking about it and get back to class. The atmosphere is stern, the message steady. Whatever happened is not to be repeated to the press. That same afternoon and the next days, a reporter from a local paper visits. The Dandenong Journal runs stories with quotes from students and staff. Larger city papers are slower, briefer, and quickly move on. Some say a television crew filmed the paddock and the people standing around its ring, and that the film was later taken away by officials. No such footage has surfaced. A teacher who took photographs says her film was collected by a man she assumed was from the education department. Those pictures did not come back. In the weeks that follow, the story fragments into smaller versions of itself, each carrying its piece of the morning. A few students say an ambulance visited because a girl fainted in the scrub and was taken away. Her full identity is uncertain in later retellings, and accounts differ on where she fell and how ill she was. Several locals, unconnected to the school, tell friends that they saw light planes circling low around that time and wondered what had caught their attention. The Air Force is said to have sent a pair of uniformed personnel to ask questions, take notes, and leave without a statement. Nothing appears in official files that pins down an aircraft, a balloon, or a training mishap on that date and place. Years turn, fields fill with houses. The scrub of the grange is trimmed back, but still there. A patch of green with walking tracks, and a quieter edge where the pines once stood thicker. The story travels across kitchen tables, then turns into a radio segment, and eventually a documentary released many years later by a filmmaker who grew up hearing about the day. Some former students agree to speak on camera. Their recollections line up more than they diverge. An object, a brief landing, a rapid departure, and a ring in the grass that stayed pressed for days despite heavy foot traffic. A science teacher, older now, remains measured, avoiding any claim that borders on certainty, repeating that he saw something that was not like the aircraft he knew. What could it have been? The most cited explanation is the simplest: a balloon. Perhaps from a high-altitude research program, shedding gas and drifting down toward open land before catching a shift in the wind and sweeping away. In the mid-1960s, the Department of Supply ran a series of very large balloon launches from inland Victoria and South Australia. The balloons carried delicate equipment to sample the upper atmosphere. When they descended, a parachute and a target panel could hang below like a flat, bright shape. Supporters of this view point to the circling light planes as a likely search for the payload, the absence of engine noise, and the wobbling hover described near the ground, which matches a balloon struggling with shifts in airflow near trees. There is even the suggestion of purple or metallic sheen under certain light angles, which thin balloon envelopes can produce. The weaknesses are stubborn. Witnesses describe the object moving against the wind and then departing at a speed that does not match a failing balloon. Official launch logs are incomplete, and no one has produced a firm record of a balloon descending over the Grange that morning. A balloon's landing usually leaves a tangle rather than a neat circle. Another idea looks toward Moorabbin and sees a training exercise that looked stranger than it was. A flock of light aircraft circling, perhaps shadowing a target banner or investigating a reported obstruction, could draw every eye upward. In the heat of the moment, with sun glare and excited voices, a reflective banner or a drogue could pass for a single, solid object. The sudden departure would be the moment the planes banked away in unison. This explanation benefits from location. Dozens of training flights operated daily from the airport, and student pilots often practiced circuits over nearby open land. But those who stood in the paddock insist they saw one coherent object holding position near the ground. A collection of light planes and a banner would have made a lot of engine noise at low level, and many remember only the thin hum of planes at a distance. Some favor a more guarded thought. An experimental craft tested low over open land and tracked by a handful of spotter planes, with authorities stepping in later to tidy the story's edges. The object's reported control near the ground, then its quick near-vertical departure, fit this narrative cleanly. The cautions here are practical. Testing a secret machine over a dense suburb in daylight is improbable. Large programs generate paper trails, fuel, maintenance schedules, and nothing the public has seen points to a test flight over Clayton South that day. The Air Force never acknowledged any such operation, and local pilots who would have noticed an unusual helicopter or jet in that corridor did not come forward at the time with a matching report. There is also the social lens. A common view, especially among skeptics of unusual aerial claims, is that the event was a shared misidentification amplified by group dynamics. A few excited students point, others join, and the mind fills in a shape that fits the stories you have heard. A teacher tries to calm the herd and looks up only once the object has faded, then repeats what the cluster insists it saw. This would account for differences in descriptions. The size of a car to the size of a house, a saucer to a hockey puck, and also for a neat circle in grass, flattened by many feet. Yet many of the most precise accounts come from adults who stood apart from the pupils, and at least one was a science teacher used to measuring, not embellishing. Several describe the same sequence: an object low to the ground, a pause and a sharp diagonal exit. And a group effect does not easily produce a persistent flattened mark in one direction that, according to locals, lingered long enough to perplex latecomers days later. A final common suggestion speaks to the most ordinary culprit in a wide open sky: a weather balloon. It requires fewer moving pieces than a secret project, and has been the conclusion in thousands of skyward puzzles. It could be so here, if a record of a launch, a drift path, and a retrieval surfaced. Despite decades of digging by researchers and local historians, the paperwork has not tied down that chain for this particular morning over this particular paddock. As the story aged, new ripples formed. A few people have said that men in suits visited their homes soon after the incident and discouraged them from speaking. Others, from the same streets, say they received no such visitor. The local paper's files show photographs and quotes, and then the newsroom moved on, as newsrooms do, with no follow-up about any official finding. The national defense file on the region is thin for that week, and any balloon program records from that era appear spotty, a mix of routine record disposal and the simple erosion of archives over half a century. It is worth stating, gently, that parts of the Westall story live in memory more than they do in records. There is no surviving film, no authenticated photograph of the object, no recovered metal. The center of it, hundreds of people looking up at something strange, still rests on human testimony. The testimonies are many. They do not agree on every detail, enough aligned to keep the moment steady in shape, if not fully in name. On quiet evenings now, the Grange still carries the feel of a place set just aside from the city. Along one path, a small artwork shaped like a flying saucer sits near the playground, part local folklore, part community marker. It reminds walkers that a story lives here. The oval at the school fills with weekend games. The pines at the far edge are thinner, the scrub more managed. But when the air smooths out around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, you can stand at the fence and look toward the old landing spot and imagine a late morning in 1966 when a bell rang. 100 voices rose, and something low and silver crossed the sky, paused, and was gone. On a cold winter road in southeast Texas, 3 people were driving home when the night changed around them. The forest fell away to light, and heat pressed through the car's windows as if the air itself had caught fire. What happened that evening is remembered as the Cash Landrum incident. The date is late December in 1980. The air cool for the Gulf Coast, about 10 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. Pine and hardwood forests line the blacktop. The nearest cities sit far enough away that the sky still goes dark between them. Betty Cash is at the wheel of a late 70s Oldsmobile. In the passenger seat is her friend, Vicki Landrum. In the back is Vicki's young grandson, drifting towards sleep. They have just finished a meal, a little holiday treat during the quiet week after Christmas, and they are taking a route home that cuts through the woods rather than following the wider highways around Houston. A little after 9 in the evening, they see a light ahead that they do not recognize. Not headlights, not a porch light set back from the road. It hangs above the trees and pulses in a way that makes Betty slow the car. As they roll forward, the glow sharpens into a shape, bright and angular, like a diamond standing on one point, with a haze of fire venting from the lower tip. The object hovers low over the road and wobbles slightly, as if fighting itself for balance. Betty stops. The world goes still except for the low crackle of heat on cold air. In later accounts, Vicki, who is deeply religious, thinks for a few stunned seconds that she is looking at a sign of final judgment. She tells the boy to pray. She gets out, stands on the center line, and stares up. Betty steps out too, drawn by the light and the rattle of flame. The heat that reaches them is startling. It feels like opening an oven door with your face too close. The boy cries, so Vicki gets back into the car to comfort him. Betty remains outside, watching, for longer than she later wished she had. The light fills the clearing above the road. The heat grows stronger. Betty's skin begins to sting. The paint on the car's hood seems to reflect the glare in a way that feels wrong, too soft and bright. She reaches for the door handle and pulls back. It is hot to the touch, so hot she needs to use a piece of cloth to grip it later. When the object wobbles again, it releases a louder roar and rises a little higher on its column of fire. Vicki yells for Betty to get back in. Betty does. Inside the car, the dashboard feels warm through the vinyl. A child's hand leaves a slight impression where the material has softened. When the object climbs above the tree line, it moves off as if drifting with a purpose. Betty, shaken, eases the car forward again. They follow at a cautious distance because the road offers no other direction home. That is when they see something else. Several helicopters, then more and more. Heavy tandem rotor cargo helicopters of the Chinook type, with their 2 slow counter-turning blades and smaller single rotor machines, all coming in from different angles. The thump of the rotors is unmistakable, a rolling chest-deep sound. The formation is more than a handful. Some witnesses over the next days will say a dozen, others say nearer 2 dozen, and they appear to bracket the glowing object as it moves away over the trees. The convoy fades toward open land beyond the forest. The night returns to a normal Texas winter, quiet and dark again. On the drive home, the heat rush fades from memory and leaves a different worry. Vicky's skin feels odd, as if sunburned after no sun. The boy falls into uneasy sleep. Betty develops a headache and a wave of nausea. By the time they reach home, all three feel unwell. In the morning, Betty's condition worsens. She has blisters on her face and scalp, and her eyes are painfully swollen. Vicky has a milder version of the same, along with tender, reddened skin on her face and hands. The boy is least affected, but still sick enough to frighten his grandmother. Within days, Betty is admitted to a hospital in Houston for close to 2 weeks. Doctors treat her for severe burns and dehydration and monitor her as patches of hair fall out. Vicky loses hair too, including most of her eyelashes. The boy recovers faster, though his appetite and sleep stay poor for a while. Away from the hospital, the car tells its own quiet story. The paint on the hood appears dulled and slightly blistered in spots. The soft interior shows heat warping on the dashboard. Some accounts mention a hand-shaped impression left where heat softened the vinyl. The engine runs, but the car feels as if it has been through something that a winter night should not cause. Away from the hospital, the car tells its own quiet story. The paint on the hood appears dulled and slightly blistered in spots. The soft interior shows heat warping on the dashboard. Some accounts mention a hand-shaped impression left where heat softened the vinyl. The engine runs, but the car feels as if it has been through something that a winter night should not cause. Word spreads. A neighbor hears the story first, then local law enforcement, then a civilian group that documents unusual aerial sightings. Investigators visit the site, roughly 30 miles northeast of Houston, take photographs, and try to track the flight of the helicopters. Letters go out to the United States Army and the United States Air Force, asking whether any large helicopter operations took place that night. The nearest large bases say no. No unit claims a mass launch. Helicopter crews at Fort Hood, where large tandem rotor cargo helicopters are common, deny flying a mission in that sector at that hour. Civilian controllers in the region say they did not see anything unusual on their scopes. The Space Center near Houston reports nothing out of the ordinary. As the weeks pass, the human side fills in. A senior investigator for the Department of the Army, a lieutenant colonel with experience in aviation matters, meets with Betty and Vicky, visits the road, and interviews neighbors who reported hearing or seeing helicopters that night. His internal report will later note that he found the women credible. He also writes, however, that he cannot identify any Army unit whose aircraft matched the described formation. The medical file thickens too, but it does not tell a complete story. Doctors document burns consistent with acute exposure to intense heat or light, along with secondary symptoms, nausea, weakness, hair loss, that resemble radiation sickness. Yet the pattern is uneven. The boy's symptoms are minimal, and both women recover slower than a pure thermal burn might suggest, but faster than a lethal radiation dose would dictate. Tests for residual ionizing radiation on the car, when performed by hospital staff and later by county officials, reportedly show normal background levels. Earlier claims of high readings, taken by enthusiastic amateurs with household meters, become hard to verify. In the spring, the families seek accountability. Letters turn to petitions. Petitions turn into a lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that the object and the helicopter formation were United States military equipment, that a malfunction led to the exposure, and that the government bears responsibility for the injuries and losses that followed. A New York attorney known for pressing the government through the Freedom of Information Act helps file the case. Years later, a federal judge will dismiss it for lack of evidence that links the event to a specific agency or unit. The government does not admit that any military operation took place there that night. What was the glowing object on a winter road? The most cited idea comes from the scene itself. A secret craft under escort, faltering over a forest road as military helicopters shepherd it toward a secure landing. In this view, the diamond-like shape and the venting flame suggest an exotic propulsion system pushed past its limits, dumping heat and rising unsteadily, while ground crews scrambled every available rotor to keep it in sight. The number of helicopters, the mix of types, the path away from populated zones, they all point to an emergency that did not make the papers because it could not. The weaknesses in this picture are practical and sharp. Moving a dangerous experimental machine over public roads would be reckless. A mass flight of military helicopters tends to leave traces, fuel logs, maintenance records, radio transcripts, witnesses along the route. Years of requests failed to produce those traces. And if the heat came from radiation, the dose strong enough to blister skin at car door range should have been catastrophic. It was not. The next idea narrows the view. Perhaps the three witnesses saw a helicopter operation itself, misread at night. Large cargo helicopters often fly with bright landing lights in formation. Under certain angles and through thin haze, those lights can dazzle and bloom around the silhouette of a rotorcraft, making a hovering object appear larger and stranger than it is. A flare drogue, a piece of burning training gear, could create a falling or hanging flame under a helicopter. It would be noisy and hot and could plausibly leave heat effects on a nearby car. This theory gains support from the many reports of helicopters that night, and from a lack of definitive evidence for a separate object. It loses ground at the point of heat intensity. Betty's burns suggest an exposure that would be hard to square with a light cluster or flares dozens of yards away. And Vicky and the boy were inside the car for the worst of it, shielded by glass and steel that would mitigate light, but not a baking temperature rise. Some have looked upward, beyond the rotor line, and suggested a re-entering rocket stage or space debris. A falling object from high altitude can glow, shed flaming material, and produce spectators who call it a craft. The path is fast and fixed, though. A fire moving on a shallow arc across a wide sky, not hovering at treetop, rising and dropping as if in mechanical distress. Re-entry does not come with a swarm of helicopters that pace it through the night. Others walk a sterner path, and call it a hoax or a shared overreaction. Memory at night plays tricks, especially around bright lights and fear. The three witnesses, two adults and a child, saw something extraordinary. Later, interviews and newspaper stories might have edged the tale into something more. This approach asks you to put the medical events aside or to explain them through stress and unrelated illness. It looks at contradictions in the retellings, exact counts of helicopters, precise directions, and sees exaggeration. The cost of this theory is empathy. Betty spent weeks in a hospital. Vicky tended a boy who threw up his dinner and could not sleep. Both women's hair came out in clumps. If it is all invention, it is invention that brought them nothing but pain and a failed day in court. A quieter, more local thought points to the industrial edges of the region. Southeast Texas holds refineries, flare stacks, and chemical plants where flames burn off gases and lights turn night into yellow noon. Against that backdrop, a distant flare could be mistaken for a hovering craft. Yet the road in question cuts through dark timber and idle pasture, not refinery rows. The object, as described by two adults who had lived their lives under that sky, moved and climbed like a thing apart. It did not sit on a known horizon. What remains are details that do not resolve into a simple shape. There are independent reports of helicopters over that area on that night, including comments by families who stepped outside to watch the formation pass. There is a lieutenant colonel's note that the witnesses impressed him as sincere. There are the softened surfaces in a car, the heat-marked hood, and a child's hand pressed into vinyl like a fossilizing moment. Against these are missing logs, quiet airfields, and silence from units that would have needed fuel and maintenance and rest after such a flight. Records are inconsistent. Later investigators disputed the reliability of early radiation readings. The car, once considered a central piece of evidence, was eventually sold and scrapped, ending the chance for careful laboratory work that might have answered at least one part of the puzzle. Closer to the end of the trail, some researchers raise a caution. The name Cash Landrum now circles in books and documentaries about nightlights, and the retelling itself can glow brighter than the history. Without an identified craft, without a confirmed military operation, the case rests on human testimony backed by physical symptoms that fit more than one cause. The core report is steady, but the edges, how many helicopters, exactly where they flew, what came out of the hospital lab, shift with each account. It is fair to say that an unidentified flying object, in the plain meaning of those words, hovered over a Texas road that night for at least two people who stood under it. It is also fair to say that no one has shown on paper who owned it. If you drive that stretch today, you pass flat fields and patches of pine, the ground sandy underfoot, the wind soft in the branches. On a cool evening, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, you can pull over at the edge of the woods and listen. Every now and then, a private helicopter crosses the sky. The rotors make that deep, steady thump. You remember a bright diamond and a column of fire that left a dashboard warm to the touch. and a winter road bathed in summer heat. The sound lifts and fades. The pines move a little, and the night, as it usually does, keeps its own counsel. A young pilot's voice carried over radio waves one October night in 1978. Calm at first, then uneasy, then abruptly gone. His name was Frederick Valentish, and his disappearance above Australia's Bass Strait has remained one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. On an October Saturday in 1978, just south of Melbourne, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentish signed out a small, single-engine Cessna for a simple trip. His plan was ordinary: leave Moorabbin in the early evening, follow the coast past the headlands to Cape Otway, then turn out over Bass Strait for King Island. It was the kind of route that looks neat on a map. Land first, then water, then a narrow runway at the end. He had filed his intentions earlier that day. Family remember a quiet young man who loved flying and spent spare hours at the airfield, talking about routes and aircraft and the way the world looks when the sun warms the wing. He had been building experience step by step. By official tallies, he had around 150 hours in the air, enough to feel at home in the cockpit, but still early in a pilot's path. He wanted the hours and the confidence that comes with them. The weekend flight to King Island offered both. The weather that evening was settled. Along the coast, light winds and good visibility held through sunset. Over the strait, small patches of cloud drifted well above the heights a low-flying Cessna would typically maintain. The air would grow darker quickly after the sun went down, turning the water into a wide slate with few visual references. That is normal in those latitudes in spring. A bright horizon slipping into even gray, then into night. A little before 6:30, Valentish took off from Moorabbin and eased the Cessna southwest. He kept the shoreline to his right, a comfort to any pilot, even an experienced one, because land provides definition. Coves, cliffs, the rhythm of waves meeting beaches. He checked in with the air traffic service in Melbourne, and later again, as he approached Cape Otway, around a little after 7 in the evening. He would soon leave the last shoulder of the mainland and point the nose across water toward King Island, which sits like a stepping stone in the middle of the strait. Then, a few minutes into that leg, something changed in his voice. He radioed Melbourne to say there was another aircraft nearby, long in shape, with bright lights. He was sure it was moving, then circling, then passing above him at speed. The air traffic controller, calm and even, looked for other registered traffic on the scope and saw none in that space. Valentish added details in short bursts, measuring what he saw while keeping the Cessna steady. 4 bright lights, a green glow, a metallic sheen when it moved, a sense that it was not flying in a normal pattern. He asked if there were any military activities operating in the area. The answer was no. The exchange continued for several minutes. Each time he spoke, the controller asked for position reports, for altitude, for bearings back to landmarks. All the normal tools of helping a pilot orient over featureless water. Valentish sounded controlled, but the edges of strain are easy to hear in transcripts from that night. He described the object as moving fast, then hovering, then following him. The engine in his small aircraft began to roughen, or at least he reported it did. The controller asked him to identify his intentions. The replies came clipped. Climbing, staying on track, but the unknown was still there. The final moments on the radio are what endure. Valentish said the object was above him again, that it seemed stationary and large, that it did not look to him like an aircraft. Then nothing intelligible for about 17 seconds. Just an open microphone and a sound later described as metallic, like a low pulsing scrape without voice. The channel went quiet. Repeated calls brought no reply. When an aircraft fails to arrive where it is expected, a simple set of actions follows. The air traffic service reached out to other aircraft in the area to ask if anyone spotted a small plane or unusual lights. They notified search and rescue and launched a sweep from both ends. Aircraft up from the mainland and from Tasmania. Marine crews dispatched into the strait. A line of attention spreading from Cape Otway to King Island and beyond. Conditions were still workable through that night and for the days after. No oil slick matched, no floating debris, no life jacket, no sign. Within 48 hours, an extensive search grid covered the likely corridor. Air crews flew low and slow in tidy lanes, eyes pressed to windows. Boats crisscrossed swell lines and cut wakes through areas marked on charts. The search lasted 4 days and then scaled back, then stopped. Bass Strait is not a kind keeper of evidence. Currents run strong, winds change quickly, and the seafloor drops away. Bass Strait is not a kind keeper of evidence. Currents run strong, winds change quickly, and the seafloor drops away. If a small aircraft slips into it, even close to shore, it can be difficult to find. Investigators built a timeline from recorded radio calls and log entries. Valentish left Moorabbin in the early evening. He reached the Cape Otway area a little after 7. He reported an unknown aircraft, then engine issues, then made his final call. That series took only minutes. Some reports place his last known position not far southwest of the Cape, still on the mainland side of the strait. Others, based on his own estimates and headings, place him farther along his track, out over deeper water. Without a distress beacon or a precise radar plot, there is no single, indisputable point to mark. Evidence, such as it is sparse and comes with caveats. 5 years later, a small part from a Cessna engine cowling washed ashore on a remote island in the strait. The piece matched the type of aircraft Valentish flew, and many consider it a likely link, but no serial number or definitive marking tied it solely to his plane. Photographs taken near Cape Otway that afternoon by a hobbyist later showed a curious shape above the horizon in one frame. But analysts who studied the negative disagreed on whether the form was an object in the sky or a processing artifact. As for the reports of strange lights along the coast that night, they appeared in newspapers in the weeks after, but without consistent descriptions or verifiable timing. They remain as soft echoes, not anchors. In the absence of a wreck, and with only a thin record of transmissions, the case settled into an uneasy space where clear facts end and considered possibilities begin. The first and most widely cited explanation is both simple and sobering. spatial disorientation over dark water, leading to a controlled flight into the sea. Pilots are taught that night over featureless surfaces can mislead the body's sense of balance and motion. Without a strong horizon line or ground lights, the inner ear can say, "You are steady" when you are descending, or turning when you are level. Bass Strait after sunset is a particularly bare space. No city glow, no strings of shoreline lights, and if the destination runway is not illuminated, no comforting beacon out ahead. In this reading, Valentish may have experienced illusions, felt pursued by lights that were stars or planets low on the horizon, and, while fixated, allowed the aircraft to sink slowly, engine running, until wings touched water. Supporters of this view point to his limited hours, the quick onset of darkness, and the way his reports jump between the object above and concerns about his engine and height. Critics of this explanation note his repeated position check-ins and insist that a pilot who remains engaged on the radio and reporting headings might not simply drift downward unnoticed. Still, the conditions and the human factors align. A second theory takes a mechanical route. It proposes that a partial engine failure, a fuel mixture issue, or icing in the carburetor in cooling evening air, or a blocked vent caused intermittent power. The uneven noise could match the metallic tone recorded in the last transmission. In failing light, while troubleshooting, Valentish may have misread his altitude or bank, and the sea took him before he could recover. Proponents point to his mention of the engine roughening and the sound itself. Those who push back note that witnesses in later tests could not agree that the recorded tone matched a mechanical failure, and that, in the weather reported, icing would be unusual, though not impossible. A third possibility is more specific and has been discussed in pilot circles for years: the black hole approach error. When a pilot expects a lit airfield and sees none, especially over dark water, the mind can begin to create distant lights where there are none, or fixate on skylights like a bright planet, as if they were oncoming traffic. Add mild turbulence and a flat sea reflecting a stray glow, and the sense of being joined by another moving object can grow persuasive. Advocates of this idea point out that King Island aerodrome lights were not operating that night because no one had been notified to turn them on. Valentish may have expected to see the runway appear and, when it did not, may have begun to search and circle, all while narrating a chase that was in fact a series of misread cues. Critics answer that his descriptions included details: a long shape, a green light, an overhead hover, that do not fit a smudge or a star. There is also the notion, passed between hangars and newspapers, that Valentish might have been flying inverted, seeing his own navigation lights reflected in the water and mistaking them for a pursuer. This would be exceptionally unlikely in his aircraft. The engine and fuel systems were not designed to run upside down for more than a moment, and the change in control feel would be obvious even to a new pilot. The theory lingers because it offers a tidy explanation for the lights, but in practice it asks for too much from a plane and too little from a pilot's sense of gravity. Other ideas drift in and out of the public imagination. Some suggest that Valentish staged his disappearance to begin a new life. This runs up against fuel reality and logistics. The flight to King Island is relatively short, and the surrounding sea has few places to hide. If he had landed somewhere else, he would have needed fuel, shelter, and silence from anyone who saw him arrive. Nothing credible surfaced in the years that followed. Others hold to a more extraordinary account, that he encountered something beyond known aircraft, as he believed in those final minutes. They note the calm tone of his observations and the last strange audio. Skeptics of this view point out that no other radar return, no other pilot report, and no physical trace corroborates an unknown craft in that space and time. The mystery here lies not in the skies, but in the gaps of the record. There is a smaller, quieter thread that reads the night as a sequence of human choices adding up to risk. Valentish chose a departure time that guaranteed darkness over water. He set a course that took him across a stretch where visual cues fall away. He may not have confirmed that the destination lights would be active. When he saw or believed he saw something unusual above him, he split attention between navigation, troubleshooting, and observation. In the cockpit of a small plane, that kind of division can be enough. None of these steps is reckless by itself. Together, on a cool spring evening, they narrow margins. The official investigation closed with no definitive cause. It listed the plane as missing and presumed lost. Families keep their own files in such cases. Letters, photographs, the ordinary notes a person leaves behind that take on a heavier meaning after the fact. In newspapers and on late-night radio shows, the Valentish story found a long echo. It carries because it leaves room for the mind to picture the scene. A quiet cockpit, instrument lights dim, the horizon fading. A voice trying to make sense of shapes in a place where shapes are hard to trust. And then the steady sweep of search aircraft and the wide, indifferent march of the sea. Far from the coast, deep in Brazil's interior, a traveler once reported arriving at a village that would not be there the next time anyone came. The year was 1923, and the place became known simply as the vanished village of C, a settlement that seemed to exist only briefly, then dissolved into rumor. In those years, the interior was drawn by rivers and mule tracks more than by maps. A small settlement could sit beyond 3 bends of a brown river, a day and a half from the nearest town by hoof, and still feel stitched into a wider rhythm. Traders stopping for salt and kerosene, a teacher chalking letters on a rough board, a bell rung by hand to call neighbors to a meeting. The village in this story was small. A few dozen houses built with timber and mud, palm thatch laid tight, a school shed at the center, with a desk made from an old shipping crate. People called it by a single initial. That letter was painted on a fence post by the footpath. No one seemed to agree later on whether that initial marked a landowner's brand, a river bend, or a word the first families shortened for convenience. But everyone simply called it C. The year had begun hot, the afternoon temperature holding near 30 degrees Celsius, or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, then falling to a warm, close night. The fresher months with their tall clouds had passed. Bananas ripened on the fringes, and manioc pulled from the earth came to the cook fires in the evening. The school had a narrow slate board, and before lessons the teacher wiped it with a damp rag that left the faint smell of stone and water in the room. Sometime near the start of the dry season, a trader arrived on a short-legged horse, the animal crusted with dust along its flanks. He expected a meal and a bowl of coffee, the friendly noise of kids, the thump of a pestle in a mortar, the usual calls that check out who's coming down the path. What he found, according to later accounts, was stillness. The first house had its door propped open with a worn shoe. Inside, a clay pot on a trivet gave off the faint, sweet, sour smell of overcooked fruit. The coals underneath had gone to ash. A tin plate and a spoon lay on a wooden stool next to it. Clothes hung on a line stretched across the room. A child's shirt and a pair of trousers moving slowly in the warm breeze. In the school shed, a simple message in chalk waited on the board. The words were short and hard. There is no salvation. A few desks had been pushed back, as if someone had swept the floor, then stopped. On the teacher's table lay a stick of chalk broken in two, and a copybook open to a page of practice letters, A through E, written in a child's careful hand. He moved through the village calling out. He found chickens wandering and a goat with a bell cropping at the grass, tied to a post. The water jars stood full. The bark cups flipped upside down next to them. He noticed a backpack near a doorway with a rolled straw sleeping mat tied to it, as if someone had packed to leave and then set it down for a moment. He whistled, waited, and then, unsettled, turned his horse and rode back to the small town downriver to fetch help. A handful of men returned with him, one wearing a worn gray coat that marked him as a local official. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low, the light going amber through the trees. The official took notes as the men walked through the houses. No signs of struggle. A shelf near one door held a few family papers and a tin with coins. A shotgun, the kind used for birds and snakes, leaned in a corner, unloaded. In a yard, someone had planted cassava cuttings in a neat row that had just started to take root. There was no smell of anything burned, no dragged furniture, no tipped bowls. Everything read as left in a hurry, but not in fear of a fight. The animals were thin but alive. The men checked the edge of the clearing. Footprints showed coming and going in many directions, then became muddled in the hard pack of the main footpath. The river lay a short walk away. Its surface moved silent and firm, a broad band of brown water sliding past the village landing. They made a camp that night on the edge of the clearing. 2 small cooking fires, men sleeping in their clothes. In the morning, they split into 2 groups. One group followed the path away from the river, the trail that farmers used to reach upland plots. The other group walked down to the landing, where long dugout canoes had often been tied to forked stakes driven into the mud. The stakes were there, and the canoes were gone. Fresh cuts showed on the stakes. A single oar lay half buried in the bank slime, a smooth length of wood with one end splintered. Farther downriver, a reed mat had caught on a snag, and a torn shirt clung to it like a flag. By midday it was hot again, near 34 degrees Celsius, or 93 degrees Fahrenheit. The men paused in the shade, drank from the water jars, and pointed out to one another how the village still held its shape without its people. The official wrote a line about the school board, and another about the missing canoes. He drew a simple map, a row of houses, the school shed, the path to uplands, the foot track to the landing. They agreed that if the people had indeed taken the canoes, they had gone down river. If they had taken the upland path, they could be at the next clearing by evening. Either way, there would be news. Someone always knew where a group had passed. But no one they asked in the next town had seen a flotilla of canoes moving with the current. No upland families reported a visit, no extra mouths returning to old cousins. Over the next days, the little search widened. A few men poled along the river's edge, checking eddies and shoals where a craft might have overturned. They found one canoe lodged under a leaning tree with a cracked seam, half full of water, nothing else. They cut into the forest for a while, in the cooler hours after dawn, then returned at noon and blinked in the glare of the clearing. The goat with the bell had wandered loose and kept to the shade of the school. Theories started then, because theories fill silence. The first was the most ordinary. A group leaves together because a threat moves near. The danger in that region in those years often came in the shape of bandits on the dry roads, men on foot wearing brimmed hats and cartridge belts, demanding food, animals, or loyalty. Whole families in the backlands kept an ear to rumor, and when talk thickened, they moved. The men at the village pointed to the missing canoes and said the people could have slipped downriver at dusk to hide at another landing until the threat passed. That idea fits the careful way the houses were left. They were not torn apart, and valuables were not gathered up. It feels like a quick decision made in the face of a possibility. Leave tonight, return in a week. The trouble is that no one came back, and no nearby settlement had a clear memory of a full village arriving in one night. People remembered visitors, yes, and a few extra workers for harvests here and there, but nothing matching C and all its families. Another idea placed the pressure not with bandits, but with a different sort of column. In the years after the First World War, political unrest and armed movements walked the interior. When groups of uniformed men moved through, some roads cleared on their own. There were stories of labor drafts for road work, tales of river crews pressing young men from villages, and of tax collectors who made life harder than it needed to be. In this view, the people of C felt the approach of such a group, or received an ultimatum, and decided, quietly and together, to leave. The line on the school board, "There is no salvation," reads in this frame like an exhausted summary, a chalk line that says we have tired of choosing between the hard edge of the road and the hard edge of the river. It explains the order. It even explains the missing canoes. But it runs into a wall when you look for paperwork. Large movements leave small traces, names in school rosters in other places, a priest's note in a hand-stitched register, a story pinned to a crossroads about where the families went. For C, no such piece with a date and a signature ever surfaced clearly. There is the health angle. The interior had hot country illnesses, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, that moved through a community and took children and elders first. The fast, sharp panic of a fever in a loved one can push families into sudden exodus. Take the boats, find a mission, find a doctor, find a place with a breeze. If such an event were building in sea, those who could lift a paddle might have loaded the canoes and pushed off, leaving meals half-eaten and doors unlatched. The words on the board, the lack of salvation, could be a tired teacher's grim conclusion after too many funerals in a row. This idea accounts for urgency and for the choice of the river. It breaks down when you ask why no one returned, even for tools or animals once the danger passed. People go back for their lives' small foundations if they can. The searchers saw no signs of graves newly dug, which would have anchored the memory. They also saw no smudge of fire or burned clothing that would have suggested an attempt to cleanse the place. The edges of this idea remain soft. This idea accounts for urgency and for the choice of the river. It breaks down when you ask why no one returned, even for tools or animals once the danger passed. People go back for their lives' small foundations if they can. The searchers saw no signs of graves newly dug, which would have anchored the memory. They also saw no smudge of fire or burned clothing that would have suggested an attempt to cleanse the place. The edges of this idea remain soft. Others point to simpler economics. The rubber trade's boom had passed its peak in that part of the world, leaving debt and quiet camps. New roads and riverboats promised easier travel and fresh wages. Families talked about following cousins to work sites, then passing along word that the wages went dry or that the foreman had vanished with the cash. In this story, the village cashed out at once. Boats loaded with what mattered most, the rest left behind, and turned into a string of relatives inside other towns. The chalked message, here, becomes either a later embellishment or one worried teacher's personal fear written down on a day when the classroom felt like the wrong room for the future. The pushback comes in the small details in the houses. A knife left on the chopping block, a bowl half full, a picture hung with a nail driven straight, not even taken down. When communities plan to leave, even fast, they often gather their little anchors, tools, icons, gifts from a wedding, because those are the pieces you can carry that carry you. C looked as if people thought they would be back by evening. With all of that, there is the sharpest possibility, one that doesn't explain the disappearance so much as it undercuts it. Later researchers who tried to plot C on a clean map ran into gaps. They searched provincial records and older newspapers looking for references to a settlement by that initial or any variant of the name that sounded like it. Some found nothing concrete. Others found scattered mentions that did not agree on a river or a district. The phrase written on the school board, "There is no salvation," does not appear in any dated contemporary document that has been shown publicly. It enters the story in retellings, sometimes in Portuguese, sometimes translated, and is repeated because it is striking. The same goes for the trader's account and the official's notebook. There are versions with precise names and dates, but when pressed, those versions trace back to stories told decades later, not to a report filed at the time. If C was indeed a clearing with houses in 1923, it may never have been more than a local nickname. If the place had a full name, that name could have changed with a new land deed, a new church, or a new map maker. Villages disappear from records as easily as they disappear in the jungle, by being called something else for long enough. A patched canoe lodged under a leaning tree is a real thing. A name can drift. Still, the shape of the story remains. A village standing under heavy heat, houses quiet, a goat's bell clinking now and then, a sentence left chalked in a school shed. What happened might be a chain of small, understandable choices. Rumors ride faster than facts in the interior. A frightened messenger arrives at dusk. Someone shouts from the landing that men are coming. A meeting is held by the school. The teacher wipes the board, then writes hard words, because that is what he feels in his chest. Everyone takes what they can carry in both hands. The women untie the canoes, the men push off, two to a craft. They travel down a river, turned black by the late hour, tie up at another bank before dawn, and blend into a cousin's house and a crowd. No one returns for the things left behind because the next day they hear different news, and the day after that they are farther away. Or the story sits on a page because someone many years later wanted to speak about impermanence, about communities that slip away from records and from our minds, while leaving behind a stark sentence in chalk. Stories like that spread because each part is possible on its own. Cooking pots do sit over coals. Doors do get left open to the breeze. People do run when trouble whispers near. And names, especially small names, do dissolve between maps. If there was a village called C, it would lie now under taller trees. The clearing sown over with seedlings, the path to the landing pressed back into forest. The school board might lie face down, the chalk ground to powder by insects and weather. The letter on the fence post would have flaked away. In a certain light, walking through green shade on a hot afternoon, you could believe you hear a bell, faint and steady, not far off, and the hush of a paddle blade sliding into water that moves toward a larger river, and then the sea. Among sailors, one name passed quietly from watch to watch: the Flying Dutchman, a ship said to appear on the horizon, glowing in strange light, doomed to sail forever without reaching shore. Whether warning or illusion, the Dutchman became one of the sea's most enduring legends. The routes that first fed the legend were hard routes in the 17th century. Tall ships worked their way down the Atlantic, aiming for the turn at the Cape of Good Hope, then out across the southern oceans toward distant ports in the Indies. Captains managed months at sea, crews lived by wind and rigging, and the weather at the southern tip of Africa could turn a day inside out without warning. The crossing where two oceans meet did not reward impatience. Waves stacked, winds veered. A decision made in 1 hour could chase a ship for weeks. Stories gathered here. One spoke of a captain who swore he would not turn back, even as a headwind pinned his ship to the sea and the rigging screamed. He cursed the gale, sailors said, and promised to round the Cape if it took him until the last day the world would turn. For that vow, or for another mistake that became a vow in the retelling, his ship was said to be condemned to sail forever. Always in sight of land he could not reach, sending signals that could not be answered. A ship you could see in full sail, the story went, but never meet. By the 1800s, the name the Flying Dutchman had settled into common speech on deck and on shore. Writers picked it up and set it into plays and poems. An opera put music beneath it. The shape changed as it moved. Sometimes the doomed captain had a name. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes the ship carried a ghostly crew. Sometimes it was only a bright outline, glowing red at the edges, as if lit from within by a low fire. But the heart of it stayed the same. There was a ship on the horizon that should not be there. It did not answer signals. It moved against wind and current. It would not vanish when it should, and then it would vanish all at once. The reports that people still cite often return to one clear morning in the early hours, in the southern seas near Australia, when a Royal Navy training ship recorded something unusual. It was the 19th century, and on a pre-dawn watch, midshipmen and officers saw, as their journals tell it, a fully rigged vessel crossing their bow at a distance where no ship should have stood so bright. The sea was calm. The wind was steady. The light on the horizon had not yet broken into day. The strange ship shone with a deep red glow. Some said, as if lit by a lantern behind a curtain. And then, as one witness wrote, it vanished like a mist. Within the same day, the sailor who first called the sighting fell from a high spar and died of his injuries, a detail that later tellings folded into the omen. Another ship from their squadron reported a similar sight that morning from a different position, which made the event feel shared rather than solitary. Even here, the documents are not simple. The journals came from young officers writing as part of their training, one of whom would later become a king. Later summaries are tidy, the original entries are plainer and more cautious, the way practical men mark an odd moment without claiming too much. The exact distance is not agreed upon. The weather was fair, then described as unusual by another. The red glow is consistent across retellings. The phrasing shifts. As the story moved from a log to a letter to a printed page, each step made it a little cleaner, as if a stiff collar had been put on a raw account, and over time it began to sound like a ghost story told by sailors, rather than notes carried by officers to their superiors. Other sightings cluster the same way, as a point of light on a timeline, then threads that follow in the press and in memory. In the late 1930s, people standing on a beach near the Cape described a ship in full sail that held its course against the wind, cutting no wake, then faded as if a patch of fog had closed over it. In the early 1940s, convoys in the Southern Ocean logged a phantom vessel that crossed their path at night and did not answer with any signal, which in wartime was recorded but not pursued. South of the equator, in a quiet corner of the Indian Ocean, a whaler reported a dim silhouette that stayed on the horizon no matter how many hours passed, neither closer nor farther, which made the crew uneasy long after it dropped from sight. None of these have photographs or measured bearings that can be checked now. They are words on a page and sentences remembered in later years, sometimes by men who were old, sometimes by journalists who wanted to make sure a reader would turn the page. But they share a shape, a ship where a ship could not be, seeming far nearer than it should be, sharper and brighter than ordinary, than nothing. To understand why sailors took the sighting seriously, it helps to stand where they stood. On a night watch, the horizon is often a thin gray line. The ocean in those latitudes holds temperature layers that stack like sheets of glass warmed at different edges. When warm air sits over a colder surface, light curves. A distant vessel tucked below the horizon can lift up, double itself, or hang like a paper cutout over the sea. Mariners know this effect. They gave it names long before physicists explained it. And one name that has lasted is a superior mirage, the kind that raises things. In some places, it takes on a more intricate form that shore people call a fata morgana, a rare mirage that stacks and stretches shapes until they look like castles or ghost towns floating in the air. At sea, it can pull a ship into view from far beyond the curve of Earth, fix it in place, sharpen its angles, and glow its edges as the sun, still below the horizon, throws light through the bent layers. This explanation answers part of the legend. Sailors around the Cape were not naive. They knew about mirages. They expected them. But a mirage, as many insist, does not usually sail against the wind. It does not send what looks like a lantern signal, with colors that suggest a real device just beyond reach. So the conversations continue, and the possible causes line up, each covering a portion of what witnesses described. Electrical glow at the tips of spars in heavy weather, known to seamen as a blue fire that clings to wood and rope, can turn a rigging into a soft-lit web. It tends to come in storms when a charge builds in the air. Some stories place the Flying Dutchman in calm conditions, in open sea, with no clouds to speak of. That does not fit. Bioluminescent plankton, disturbed by a moving hull, will trail a ship in milky light for hours, and in some waters the glow is strong enough to be seen like a veil under the keel. But if no wake is seen, there is little to name that would explain a light hovering ahead. Another line of thought follows the eyes rather than the sea. Night watches stretch. Your ears carry the work of remembering what you're hearing. The wind in the lines, the creak of wood, the quiet ticks of a clock. Pre-dawn light is tricky. It washes colors into red and gray. Salt haze, even on a clear night, blurs distance in a way that a good telescope in that era could sharpen and at the same time distort. Early glass had quirks. Purple fringes came and went. In a dim view, the brain fills gaps, and expectation walks quietly alongside perception. A lookout hears that another watch, on another ship, somewhere in this sea, reported an odd vessel last week. Only a few men have seen it. Everyone else jokes and forgets. But then a shape appears on the horizon where you are looking, and if you hold your breath and keep it in sight, it can resolve into a ship whose sails post against a brighter band of sky, and from there the story writes itself into your log in patient words that feel solid as they leave your hand. Even more mundane sequences can produce a legend. A vessel might be seen near dawn. Word goes around that it vanished. In truth, it changed course when the horizon hit it, and no one tracked the change, because the officer of the watch decided it was not a threat. Later that morning, an accident happens. A misstep aloft, a fall that follows a call to reef a sail. In the mind, the cause and effect ladder is built on the spot. We saw the ship that sailors fear, and then a man died. The ladder stands until some other explanation climbs higher, and in the absence of a firm reason, the story takes precedence. It is also true that the legend was carefully tended on shore. The opera, the novels, the broadsides sold in ports, these gave the Flying Dutchman a weight that it might not have gathered on deck alone. A young midshipman who had read a play will notice more in a pale outline than one who has not. A reporter who needs a column will spend a few more words on the red glow than on the note that the sea was colder than the air. This is not to dismiss every sighting. It is to see how a name already heavy with meaning can attract new sightings and make them feel older and deeper than they are. Still, the Cape keeps its catalog of odd light. Winter winds draw long lines of cloud that break and reform, driving bands of warmer air over colder water. A ship 30 or 40 miles away can appear close enough that you think you can see figures on deck. Inverted images stack above the real hull, making masts stretch into paddles. Sails look fixed at impossible angles. On very rare mornings, the whole scene flushes with a low red cast as the sun lies just under the world, turning the edge of the light rich and strange. To a man on a watch who has come up from sleep to cold air and a horizon that lifts as if it were breathing. That set of conditions is enough to produce something you do not forget. And then there is the omen. The Flying Dutchman, for some crews, meant bad luck. Not doom necessarily, but something bent. The lore says you might see it before a line parts, or a squall that had not been forecast slaps the sails flat and fills the boat with fine spray, or before an illness spreads that no one expected. The tendency to link a sighting to a later misfortune is a human tendency. It makes a random sea feel patterned. It makes memory tidy. The logs that skeptics like to point to do not show a clean chain from image to accident. What they show are separate entries that later readers stitched with thread made for this purpose. Even so, to a small community afloat in a large sea, a sign that could be read and passed down had value. It reminded everyone to check the lines again, to beat a drum on deck, to bring a new rhythm to tired hands, to keep an eye on the swell and a measure in the hold. The plainest answer is the least dramatic. Light bends, and the sea is a field that can fool the eye even when you are trained and steady. But that answer sits alongside another truth, which is that names hold power. And when a name has enough weight, it can pull uncertain observations into its orbit and keep them there. For sailors who stood long watches with cold hands on a rail, the Flying Dutchman was not a tale to pass an hour. It was a shorthand for the uneasy category of things you can see but not reach. It let a lookout say quietly that something in the world felt off tonight. So the legend endures. In some corners, fishermen still point at a pale smudge on a line of gray water and say the name without much need to explain. In others, hikers on a headland watch an early morning mirage and feel lucky to have been there when the air stacked just right. Whether a ship that never makes port still works the wind out past the Cape is a question that does not need an answer to be useful. The image is what remains. A set of sails, lit from underneath by a low red dawn, holding to a line that never closes, asking you to measure distance with your eyes and accept that the ocean does not always return what you send into it. Our last story brings us to the heart of North America, where Lake Michigan stretches wide as an inland sea. For more than a century, ships and planes have vanished within its waters, earning the region a reputation as the Lake Michigan Triangle, a place where routine journeys sometimes ended without explanation. Lake Michigan lies long and north-south, a deep corridor of cold, clear water cupped between forests and cities. People have drawn a loose triangle on its surface, points shifting slightly depending on who tells it. But most place the corners near Milwaukee on the western shore, Ludington on the eastern shore, and Benton Harbor farther south. It is a neat shape over a busy stretch of lake. Ferries cross it. Fishing boats work it. Freighters pass through on their way to the straits. Pilots cut over it at night to save time. Weather pours down the length of the water, clean and fast, and changes its mind without warning. The lake is beautiful, and it is practical, and it is unforgiving. In late spring, the surface can still feel like snowmelt. The water stays cold enough to sap strength in minutes. Fog can arrive like a door closing. Squall lines stand up across the horizon and turn a reasonable plan into a hard problem. The lake has all the makings of stories. People begin the triangle's list back in the late 19th century with a wooden schooner that left port and did not return. She was called the Thomas Hume, a compact workhorse loaded with timber and outbound from Chicago toward Muskegon. She sailed into a night with freshening wind and never struck her next harbor. Days later, searchers found no planks, no life ring, no crew. Insurance men argued. Captains took sides. Had she been run down by a larger vessel? Did she capsize under a sharp squall? For years, the answer was only absence. Much later, divers found a wreck that fit her shape and her fittings, settled upright in deep water off the eastern shore. The wood was intact down to small details. Nothing pointed to sabotage. The lines instead suggested a sudden gale and a hard capsize, the sort of ordinary catastrophe that leaves no witness and no floating proof. Not every case that people place inside the triangle ends with a ship. In the spring of 1937, a freighter named after her owner, carried a load of coal through the last stretches of late-season ice. The captain, George Donner, kept the night himself, checking charts, looking at the weather, staying on his feet while his crew stood regular watches. Just after midnight, close enough to port that he allowed himself a brief rest, he went to his cabin and told the mate to come for him when lights were in sight. The cabin door was locked from the inside, around the time when a captain would expect to be called. The mate walked down the passage and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still quiet. He fetched others, and together they forced the door. The bunk was empty. The window, large enough for a man to pass through if he wished, stood unlatched, curtains moving in the draft. No one had seen the captain on deck. The lake had a light swell, nothing dangerous. Searchers checked the deckhouses, the holds, even the coal pile, then turned the ship inside out again, as if the weight of looking might change the result. It did not. The official view is a simple one: that he woke disoriented, stepped out to have a look, and slipped. That is how the lake answers most riddles. Still, the locked door and the open window keep this one on lists, the freighter plowing onto port with her master gone. 2 decades earlier, a small passenger and cargo vessel out of Benton Harbor was found upside down near the middle of the lake, her hull bearing the broad bruise of a collision. She belonged to a religious communal group along the southern shore, and her crew and passengers were drawn from that community. Everyone aboard was gone. The blow on the hull spoke plainly of an impact, but no other vessel reported striking anything that night. Busy waters and fog make that plausible. 2 captains on converging courses, a thud in the dark, one boat able to sail on, and the other not. There were no radios aboard to pass word that something had happened. The lake remained quiet about the other half of the story, and it remains quiet now. In the early 1950s, the Triangle's reputation reached the sky. On a June night in 1950, a 4-engine airliner full of passengers bound west with a planned stop in Minneapolis crossed the lake at altitude. The air over the water was busy and uneven. Thunderstorm towers flickered in the distance. The crew asked to descend to a lower, smoother layer. The request was denied by controllers trying to keep traffic safely separated in rough weather. A few minutes later, the plane's voice faded with a last routine call. In the morning, small items washed in near South Haven: seat cushions, insulation, scraps of paperwork, followed by a grim drift of what officials could only call remains. Boats and aircraft searched day after day over a wide area. Nothing of the main wreckage was found. Families gathered on the beach and watched the lake until the search moved on. In the years since, crews with side-scan equipment have swept the bottom many times. Each sweep felt hopeful at the start, and each ended with only sand and long natural ridges. A stone marker on a small rise not far from the shoreline lists the names of those lost and points toward water that did not give up the plane. These are the clean lines of the Triangle's core. A ship that should have made a short overnight passage and did not. A captain who could not be woken and was no longer aboard. A small vessel turned turtle by something that did not stop. An airliner vanishing into dark lake and thunder. The list runs on. Ferries have gone down in heavy seas. Family fishing boats have left no signal and left no trace. Now and then, people add newer notes that seem to expand the mystery sideways. On a spring night in the mid-1990s, residents along the eastern shore around the town of Holland called dispatchers to report lights moving in odd patterns over the lake. A weather radar technician who happened to be on shift watched returns that did not behave like lightning or a storm front. The calls continued for hours, then tapered. No explanation satisfied everyone. Some pointed to temperature layers that bend radar and light. Others thought of aircraft training beyond normal areas. Whatever the cause, the reports settled into local memory like another stone on a cairn. There are even stories from the bottom itself. In the early 2000s, a small team mapping the lake bed north of the triangle reported a curious arrangement of stones, aligned in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. One stone, blurry in sonar imagery, was said to bear the outline of a large, prehistoric animal. News of this traveled quickly. Archaeologists who went back to check the site later described a natural jumble shaped by ice and water, not a human circle, and the carving as lines that looked more like joints in fractured rock than art. The excitement cooled. The lake is good at making patterns that are not what they seem to be. If a triangle exists here, a skeptical mind asks, what holds its corners together beyond a line on a map? The first answer is simple traffic. This is one of the busiest inland waterways in the world. More vessels moving on the water and more aircraft above it mean more accidents, more breakdowns, more chances for bad weather to intersect with tired people at the end of a long shift. When a region becomes rich in stories, patterns follow naturally, even if the events inside the lines can be explained one by one. Weather is a second anchor. Unlike a warm sea, this lake holds cold year-round beneath a surface that can be inviting. A clear day can turn to whitecaps and spray in less than an hour. Autumn brings steep waves that stack and then collapse into troughs, knocking a hull sideways at the wrong moment. The air over the lake builds sudden boundaries, sharp changes in temperature and moisture that birth lightning cells and strong downdrafts. A small boat with low freeboard, a schooner loaded a little too heavily, a pilot navigating by lightless horizon in turbulence, all are vulnerable to the same quick turn of conditions. Mariners on the lake have a term for thick fog banks that slide in fast and smother sightlines. Once you are inside one, even a compass and a horn can feel like thin tools. Then there is the water itself. The bottom of the lake is not flat. Long ridges run north-south like waves frozen in sand. Pockets cut deep and then climb again to shallows. In bad weather, waves crossing those changes build confused seas. Close to the surface, the same waves can hide a person within arm's length. The cold strips heat in minutes. Even a strong swimmer who slips off a deck at night can be gone before anyone understands what the thud they heard was. What about stronger claims, compasses swinging oddly, strange pulls on instruments, a place where physics misbehaves. Surveyors and lake researchers do not report unusual magnetic pockets here. They note the ordinary quirks that come with steel hulls and electrical lines, nothing more. Legends are loud where facts are quiet. It is tempting to add a layer of the uncanny, but the evidence for that layer is thin. Still, some details resist neat filing. The captain in 1937 left a locked room in a freighter that never slowed. If he slipped, why did no one hear? In the 1950 air disaster, fragments and remains came ashore, which clears up one question and leaves the harder one. How could a modern airliner vanish so completely in a body of water that many people think of as familiar? The small vessel out of Benton Harbor shows the mark of a collision with no partner. These are not impossibilities. They fit within the range of what lakes and people can do to each other. But they are the kinds of facts that give shape to a story and carry it forward. And so we've wandered across icy passes, vanished towns, lonely highways, playground skies, and restless seas. Each story carried with it facts, theories, and whispers, but none gave us certainty. That may be the point. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some exist to remind us of how fragile our knowledge can be, how wide the horizon really is. As you settle deeper into rest, let the questions drift too, not for solving, but for holding softly, like stones at the bottom of a river. Tomorrow they will still be there, waiting. But for now, the mysteries can keep watch, and you can let go. Good night, and thanks for letting me keep you company.